Are we ready for another Puscast? A review of the infectious disease literature of the last 2 weeks of April in the year 2017. References are available online at edgydoc.com, where, of course, you will find links to my growing multimedia empire of blogs, books, apps, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. But really, if you haven't read The Puss Whisperer, go to Amazon and buy it. It's well worth your time. I'm not biased, oh no. But let's move on to the literature, shall we? Before we get on to the literature, might I suggest for your edification a fascinating article in Emerging Infectious Diseases called The Discovery of Penicillin, New Insights After More Than 75 Years of Clinical Use. Well, you will find such pearls as only 1 in 1,000 penicillium strains actually makes penicillin. And the initial strain from which they derived penicillin was kind of punky at making it, and they found another penicillium species on a moldy cantaloupe in a market, which produced 6 times more penicillin than Fleming's strain. Or how the French kept their German guards drunk so they could make penicillin during the war. This is a great little article in the May Emerging Infectious Diseases. But let's get on to some practical stuff. And as long as we're on the topic of antibiotics, there's a report that a combination of ceftriaxone and lansoprazole increases the QT interval. What the hell's lansoprazole? Oh, Prevacid. I hate it when I only know the brand name of a drug. At least I never prescribe them. So add ceftriaxone plus lansoprazole to your list of QT interval prolongating antibiotics. And it's my understanding that torsades is a bad thing, right? I will say as an aside, there are other case reports of torsades in patients on ceftriaxone. And it's always been an interesting question whether that drug will promote that particular side effect. I always thought it was a fluke because it happened rarely enough. But maybe it is a drug-drug interaction. As we head into mosquito season, here's a little factoid about Zika virus, and I will just quote the conclusion. 99% will experience symptoms within 2 weeks of exposure and 50% within 1 week. Persons for whom symptoms develop greater than 2 weeks after travel and tests for a recent Zika virus infection are positive should be evaluated for alternative modes of transmission, sexual transmission, or local vector-borne transmission. So the maximum incubation period is 14 days for Zika. And azithromycin interferes with Zika virus in the brain, preventing it from destroying CNS cells. So it would be a consideration in a pregnant woman who is Zika seropositive, and for whatever reason, termination was not an option. Of course, it's always quite a leap from in vitro studies to pregnant humans, but sometimes that's all you got. And if you want to add another virus to your list from South and Central America, in Panama they have the Punta Toro virus. It is spread by the sand flea. It's an alpha virus and causes fevers, headache, myalgia, and leukopenia, like every other damn virus in that part of the world. I guess it's in the same family as Rift Valley fever and tick-associated severe fever with thrombocytopenia, only it's a milder illness. Although most of the patients who were seropositive for this virus were initially thought to have dengue, but were seronegative. Punta means a body of water, and it's also a derogatory term for female buttocks. And toro is bull, so I can't really figure out the word origin. Thank you, Dr. Wakefield. Mumps is at an all-time high, Texas especially, but there have been almost 2,000 cases in 42 states since January of this year. So mumps is booming. In Italy, measles is booming, as well as in Romania, driven in large part by anti-vaccine fears. Romania has had some deaths. Something like 42 million people visit Italy every year. I'm sure some of them are going to bring measles home to the United States. Yay, maybe I'll finally get to see a case. Not really on my bucket list of diseases. So another drug reaction, this one to raltegravir. Patients with HIV can get the DRESS syndrome. DRESS stands for drug reaction with eosinophilia and systemic symptoms. And in this study, it turns out that patients have a genetic predisposition. There's an association with the HLA-B53:01 allele. So you can probably screen for that allele to see if patients are at risk, and then you can say no to the DRESS. Yes, I have watched Say Yes to the DRESS. You want to make something of it? So septic patients, immunocompetent septic patients, can reactivate a variety of herpes viruses and be viremic. Included are CMV, EBV, HHV6, HSV1 and 2, and VZV, although only reactivation of CMV and EBV was associated with increased mortality. And there is still no information as to whether or not an intervention against these herpes viruses would make a difference. Most of the data to date being with CMV in the ICU leading to increased mortality. We really do need an intervention trial, perhaps combining acyclovir with vitamin C. By the way, if you're interested, my most recent Quackcast, one of my other podcasts, is about vitamin C and sepsis. Data is encouraging, but I'm skeptical. Go figure. And there's a nice review, historical, called Anthrax Cases Associated with Animal Hair Shaving Brushes. During the First World War, they could not get enough badger hair for your shaving brush. Yeah, badger hair. That's what's in the shaving brush I use. And instead used horse hair that was disguised to be badger hair. I guess they didn't have to show no stinking badgers. And the horse hairs were not disinfected, and people got cutaneous anthrax from shaving with horsehair brushes. I also did not know that shaving cream was not invented until 1925. In England, badgers carry Mycobacterium bovis. I wonder if there's been any cutaneous outbreaks from shaving due to that risk. But I will tell you that badger hair brushes are the best for applying your shaving cream or soap. I just love ID and history. So this week you can read about penicillin and cutaneous anthrax over at Emerging Infectious Diseases. You have an older person with neurologic symptoms. Is it due to syphilis? This study looked at 370, get this, HIV negative, that's important, syphilis patients who had neurologic symptoms. And the question is, did they have neurosyphilis? They had a hodgepodge of neurologic symptoms: hemiplegia, dysphagia, failure to thrive, seizures, headache, blah, 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 blah. This was an older population. The mean age was 54. And they found in this group that if the RPR was greater than 1 to 4, and if the TPPA was greater than 1 to 2560, or, interestingly, an elevated serum creatinine kinase, all of these increased the chance that the patient had neurosyphilis. And if their RPR was less than 1 to 2 and their TPPA was less than 1 to 1280, they were unlikely to have syphilis and probably didn't need a lumbar puncture. That used to be a common cause for consultation back in the early part of my practice in the 90s. Older women whose husbands are dead with dementia or hearing loss or some neurologic symptoms, and they also had a peripheral positive test for syphilis. And I was always asked, do they need a lumbar puncture and treatment for neurosyphilis? So here at least is some rough rules of thumb to help determine that. Although I think from a practical point of view, you can't risk a false negative. So everyone, unless they have a pristine spinal tap, will probably get treated for neurosyphilis anyway. And as I mentioned before, my CSF RPR is a false positive. And I never really know what to make of case reports. There was 2 patients reported in Japan who were pregnant, who were treated with amoxicillin probenecid in one case, amox probenecid and ceftriaxone in another case, and neither baby acquired syphilis. And there have been other studies to suggest that ceftriaxone is effective for all the classic reasons that we give penicillin for syphilis, but I'd still be old school and give penicillin if I could. And there's more to treponemes than syphilis. There's also yaws, which is due to Treponema palliatum subspecies pertinu. And in Yaz endemic area of Southeast Asia, it's found in macaques. These were pet macaques, not wild macaques. And as I mentioned before, there used to be a burger joint in Northeast Portland called Yaz. It was noted for great burgers and fries back in my childhood. Now I kind of always wonder, what was in Yaz burgers? There's an organism called Simcania negavensis. It's an obligate intercellular organism. It's found in aquatic environments, swimming pools, water supplies, spas, etc. It may be associated with human disease. This study looked at seropositivity in both hemodialysis patients and in transplant patients, kidney transplant patients, and found that patients were often seropositive, 22% of hemodialysis patients and 9% of renal transplant patients. And the organism was found in all the water samples analyzed, although it seemed to have caused no disease in these patients, at least none that was directly credited. Although they do wonder in the article about the constant exposure through dialysis water of these patients and the subsequent inflammatory response, and the potential adverse consequences of having an ongoing inflammatory response secondary to this exposure. It's an interesting hypothesis. Last month, we had a great trip to San Antonio and Corpus Christi. It was a lot of fun. But Texas is just chock-a-block full of infections. Here's a case report of a febrile soldier in Texas who developed an infection with Borrelia turricae. Sometimes headlines can be misleading. This article from the CDC was entitled, "Number of Deaths from 10 Leading Causes by Sex." And I thought, there are 10 different ways you can get killed by sex? No, it was just deaths segregated by gender. But the CDC needs to be more careful in their headline writing. Well, sex may not kill you, but it can cause some problems. Out of Hawaii, they had 8 Neisseria gonorrhea isolates. 7 were resistant to azithromycin. 5 had decreased susceptibility to ceftriaxone. I think gonorrhea is likely to be the first pan-resistant organism that infects people as part of normal existence. I mean, Acinetobacters are not a problem for you and me. Gonorrhea is not a problem for me. I can't speak for you. But it's one of those organisms like group A strep that just infects normal people as part of daily activities. It's when those get resistant that we are really going to be in a world of hurt. I think the motto used to be, what happens in Vegas goes home to your significant other. I think you can substitute Hawaii for Las Vegas at this point. How long to treat febrile urinary tract infections? That would be a marker of pyelonephritis. This study out of the Netherlands randomized people with outpatient febrile UTIs, a quarter of whom were bacteremic, to either 7 days or 14 days. 7 days suffice for women. 14 may be a better option for men. And they were all ciprofloxacin treated, by the way. Which coagulase negative staph is pathogenic and which one is contamination is always a problem. This study looked at all the blood cultures for non-staph epidermidis bloodstream isolates and found that if it were certain organisms, then it was likely a relevant infection. And they found that 96.6% of infections were due to Staph hemolyticus, capitis, hominis, and lugdunensis, whereas Auricularis, capri, Schefflerii, Pettenkoferii, Sacrolideus, and Simulans were all garbage. Now that we have the MALDI-TOF, you can get a identification of which coag-negative staph, and you can give a better idea as to whether or not this is the real deal or not by the species. These were mostly, by the way, central line infections and endocarditis. Just like in fantasy novels, when you have the true name of something, you can then control it. I'm talking Name of the Wind fantasy here, not 50 Shades of Grey. Just to be clear. One of those risks that you can modify, benzodiazepines in the elderly Alzheimer patient who lives in the community increases their risk for pneumonia. Probably comes as no surprise. Anything that decreases your mental status will increase your risk for pneumonia probably. though it may be a trade-off so they don't punch out their spouse. How do you treat endocarditis? Well, you get blood cultures, and then you tailor your antibiotics against the organisms that you grow in the blood. Because endocarditis is usually a monomicrobial infection, right? Maybe not. Now, this study, although small in number, took a bunch of valves out at surgery, and they did 16S ribosome testing. And they found a large number of mostly non-viable organisms, most of whom I cannot pronounce, also present in this vegetation. I can neither pronounce nor have I heard of many of the organisms they found. So like other infections, there are more organisms in the infection than are dreamt of in my philosophy. And endocarditis may also be a polymicrobial infection. Given the ubiquity of bacteremia in humans, every time we brush or floss, I suspect is that when you get a staph infection and you get a clot, the transient bacteremias of non-pathogenic organisms then seed your valve. This was only 8 cases, 5 of whom had prosthetic valves, and all had the clinical scenario of requiring surgery for repair of their infection. So I don't know how widely applicable this is to all other endocarditides, since most of them are cured medically, even if you don't treat this hodgepodge of extra organisms. But it's still very interesting and may explain the occasional failures we see when we apparently have good directed therapy against the organism in question. I was always under the impression when putting valves in shooters that a biovalve was better than a mechanical valve. But for endocarditis, it would appear that mechanical valves are better than biovalves in terms of reinfection and need for reoperation. This was a meta-analysis of 11 studies with 10,000 plus patients, 6,700 biologic valves and 3,900 mechanical valves. And patients who got the mechanical valves did better. A couple of tuberculosis things. First, this meta-analysis suggests that 3 times weekly therapy is not as good as daily therapy for the treatment of tuberculosis. That does not surprise me in the slightest. Longer, more, and better for tuberculosis, which is a little different than most bacterial infections, which is fewer and shorter is probably better. And in another study, they actually analyzed the cough of patients with tuberculosis. Important since cough is the way you spread the disease. They found that patients usually coughed in the middle of the day, less often in the morning, and that as their treatment and culture conversion kicked in, they had less cough. By 2 weeks, 30% had culture conversion of their sputum, but they were still coughing, and therefore perhaps still infectious. And interestingly, 1 in 8 patients with tuberculosis had no cough. In Los Angeles, they screened 4,755 Latin American-born residents and found a Chagas rate of 1.24%, implying at least 30,000 people with Chagas in the LA area alone. The Salvadorans had the highest rate at 3.45%, and in the Mexican respondents, it depended on where you were from. The Oaxaca, Oaxaka, and the Zacatecas, Zacatecas, had the highest rates out of Mexico. If you extrapolate that to the Latin American population in the United States, that's a lot of Chagas. We do have a form of paragonomyosis in the United States. Paragonomus kellicoti, Kellicotti. Almost all the cases have been reported in Missouri. Most patients had lung problems, but there are now a couple of cases in CID of eosinophilic meningitis with this paragonomyosis. Both enjoyed fishing in the streams of Missouri and both ate raw crawfish. And it looks like up to 2/3 of the crawfish in Missouri have this organism in them. Crawfish sushi, bad idea. And another study to show that ID consultation decreases length of stay and mortality in patients in a French hospital. It's amazing what happens when you get a consultation from someone who actually knows what they're doing. And that brings this Puscast to a close, covering the last 2 weeks of April in the year 2017. References are available at edgydoc.com, as well as links to my stagnant or growing multimedia empire. Otherwise, as always, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I shall continue to follow along because the patient will have better outcomes. Thank you. In dictation, and goodbye.